Hello, so today we're covering Sand County Almanac, so an excerpt from Aldo Leopold's book, Sand County Almanac from 1949. And so Aldo Leopold was a conservationist, ecologist, philosopher, really, who was born in 1889, died in 1948. So Sand County is really the name of the terrain in Wisconsin, whereby he was living. Aldo Leopold was living, and so this book was written shortly after his. Excuse me. This book was published shortly after his death, and he died, oddly enough, helping a neighbor to fight a fire that was on their property, and he died of a heart attack. So he died helping a neighbor of his, interestingly enough. So he lived in Wisconsin, wrote Sand County Almanac in 19. Is actually written in 48, and then I think it was published in 49, because he died, I think, in 48. Okay, so it was written shortly before he died. So what we're looking at is the way in which we're getting an establishment of what is known as the land ethic. That is how we're understanding what a land ethic is. So that's the reason why we're looking at this essay, okay? And so we're trying to key it into a few of the subchapters. So the first subchapter is the ethical sequence. So he writes, quote, "An ethic is a limitation on freedom of action in a struggle for existence." So, in other words, ethics have to do with the way that we're mediating our freedoms in terms of our limitations. So we have limitations in our life, we also have freedoms, and he's showing that ethics serve as a way in which we're understanding a mediation between the two. And then likewise, we could also think of ethics for him as a mediation between the social and the antisocial, which is fascinating, right? So that's yet another way in which we could understand what ethics are. And then he also writes, "An ethic may be regarded as a mode of guidance for meeting ecological situations," and this is something that's not easily seen by the individual, right? And so that's what we're trying to get to do, is to see beyond individuals, to be understood within a community, and not just a community of people, but within a biotic community, okay? So, but that also has a way that we're working with other people, obviously, right? And so knowing that competition and instincts go hand in hand, and likewise cooperation and ethics go hand in hand. So it's this way that we're working whereby we usually think that competitiveness and every man for himself is more important than cooperation and ethics. And so he's wanting us to emphasize cooperation and ethics, obviously, right? Because we want to get out of this mode of the conqueror, because the way that the egoistic conqueror understands the land is not to value what the land is in and of itself, but to value it for its economic, what it could be, what it could give economically, right? And then so also too, he has these points on science as well, and the points with science are interesting, and we need to be super careful with them, because his critique of science is not anti-scientific, but rather getting us to see that there's a way of working that we need to understand our community that goes beyond science. So in other words, we have a grounding of our environment, and that way that we understand our environment is not exclusively understood by way of science alone, okay? So in other words, he's not anti-scientific, so we need to be super careful there to understand that. But all he's really pointing out is that even science doesn't have all the answers. So, in other words, let's get away from this idea that the only way in which we're going to understand our involvement with the land is scientifically. He's saying let's go beyond that and underneath that, really, to start thinking of how it is that we're understanding ourselves within a so-called biotic team, right? That, in other words, we have an involvement with the land that is beyond a scientific understanding. Is probably the simplest way to think about it, right? Then he has also some points on Kentucky bluegrass, which are interesting. So the point on Kentucky bluegrass really is that we don't always understand our involvement with the landscape as an involvement. Rather, we're not clear on how it is that we are affecting the land just as much as nature is affecting the land as well. So in other words, the changes in the terrain in this area in Kentucky that he's referring to are also man-made changes. They're not just natural changes. So we might even think that the way that we look out to a Kentucky landscape might be something that we're looking at nature in its pristine condition, but know that this more has to do with plant succession that's brought on by human involvement. So in other words, we don't always recognize the profound impact we have on a community, on a biotic community, and that's its point. So then the next subchapter is the ecological conscience. So know that conservation is a state of harmony between man and land, is one of his quotes. So conservation is a state of harmony between man and land. So this way that we're thinking of harmony, how do we establish that? We might start asking ourselves, well, how is it that we're becoming educated? And so the responsibility of educating ourselves also goes beyond just this shallow view. And so his way of thinking is that we might think that becoming educated means obeying the law, voting, and joining organizations, and the government will do the rest. So there we need to also be careful because, again, yes, voting is important, and yes, obeying the law and joining organizations are important, but what he's pointing out more is that we have responsibilities to the land beyond that, and then likewise, we need to be careful where we're not thinking that whatever it is that we don't understand about our land involvement, we need to leave up to the government to take care of, etc. So in other words, that responsibility is something whereby we need to get a better grasp of our obligation to the land that goes beyond just our political involvements and our economic involvements, etc., right? So in other words, educating ourselves is getting us to a better understanding of our obligations to the biotic community, okay? And that's what he's trying to get us to point ourselves to, right? So in other words, he brings up a point on remediation of the soil in Wisconsin by farmers in the 1930s, whereby he notices that when they were left to do something on their own to help with the remediation, they only did the parts that helped them. And when it came time to doing remediation for the community at large, beyond self-interest, the landowners were not as good on that point. So in other words, we're good with looking at our own self-interests and what our economic interests are for the moment, but yet our shallow view, but yet we're not very good at looking at the interests of the community at large, not only of people, but also of plants, animals, and non-sentient beings beyond just that community as well, just beyond the social community to be an ecological community. Okay, so that's what we're looking at, is that the ecological community is what we're looking at first and foremost for Leopold in his land ethic, And the other types of communities, the social, the political, and the economic, rest on that community, right? That those are results of that biotic community. So like when we look at the land pyramid, that land pyramid shows us that kind of involvement. So let me point it out to you. So this is one of the last subchapters. So with the land pyramid, we have at the bottom here soil, then plant life, insects, omnivores, carnivores up at the top, okay? Deal is that the top here relies on the elements of the bottom, so that what he's thinking is that, or what he's trying to show us is that we have this involvement that's interdependent, not something whereby it's a top-down approach to the way that we're understanding ecology, right? And so that's important to start recognizing. So we're getting this sense of how people's interests and social conscience must start keying into a land ethic, whereby we're understanding the importance of the land first and foremost to be a way in which we're understanding our own involvement conscientiously, okay? And then he brings up something, a subchapter on substitutes for a land ethic. This might be what Arne Naess had as shallow ecology. And so this is really, it's very simple. In other words, we are often thinking of the interest in the land by way of strict economic interest, right? So in other words, when the United States recently pulled out of the Paris Accord, one of the reasons that was offered was strictly economic. That in other words, it was too expensive to start working on our involvement with the land, because that would present too much of, that would be too expensive for companies to start taking on, right? And then so, in other words, one of the problems with looking at the way that we're understanding our involvement with the land economically is that there are animals and plants, elements within the land that might just be reduced to economic value, where he's saying that there are plants, animals, and non-sentient beings that go beyond economic value, right? And when we reduce our land involvement to economics, we sacrifice elements that are not economically valuable for us, right? That we don't recognize as economically valuable, and we do so at our peril, right? And I think that that's really important for us, because when we're focusing on wildlife conservation, etc., we often are thinking of that in terms of economic value above and beyond the biotic community in which the animals and plants exist, right? So in other words, that probably is a good place to stop, so that we could then start talking about how we're working with this. All right? So thanks.